The difference between a genius and a fool is often measured by who gets the last 5 minutes. The Ferrari sat beneath a ring of white lights like a trophy nobody could claim. Hundreds of people had gathered inside the exhibition hall at Hayes Automotive Technologies just outside Dallas. Engineers, mechanics, investors, journalists, and executives filled the massive space. Some had traveled across the country for a chance to witness what many had begun calling the most expensive unsolved automotive mystery in America. At the center of it all stood a deep red Ferrari that looked flawless. Its paint reflected every light in the building. Its bodywork appeared perfect. Yet for 5 years, it had defeated every expert who touched it. Victoria Hayes stood on an elevated platform overlooking the crowd. As founder and chief executive of the company, she had built a reputation for solving impossible problems. This one was different. This one had defeated everyone. 5 years, she said into the microphone. 5 years of diagnostics, testing, analysis, redesigns, consultations, and failed solutions. The audience listened carefully. Some of the best engineers in the world have examined this vehicle. Behind her, large screens displayed photographs of previous attempts. Teams of specialists. Laboratories. Performance facilities. Experts from Europe, Asia, and North America. Every one of them believed they were close, Victoria continued. Every one of them was wrong. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. The challenge had become legendary. The Ferrari would occasionally operate perfectly, then suddenly fail without warning. No pattern. No consistent explanation. No lasting solution. Millions of dollars had been spent trying to find answers. Victoria looked toward the car. Even after 5 years, the frustration remained visible in her eyes. Today, she said, the challenge remains open. The crowd straightened. Anyone who can identify the true cause and permanently solve the problem will receive a substantial reward and the recognition that comes with succeeding where everyone else has failed. Cameras flashed throughout the room. Excitement immediately spread through the audience. Several engineers exchanged confident smiles. Others studied the Ferrari as though seeing it for the first time. Near the back of the hall, Ethan Carter stood quietly beside a vending machine. Few people noticed him. His brown work jacket showed signs of years spent in repair shops. His toolbox rested beside his boots. Nothing about him suggested world-class expertise. Nothing about him suggested he belonged among executives and industry leaders. His phone vibrated. Ethan glanced down and smiled immediately. Lily. A message appeared on the screen. Do not forget tonight. Attached was a photograph of a school auditorium stage. Ethan's smile widened. Tonight was her school performance. He typed a reply. I will be there. A few seconds later another message arrived. Promise? Ethan looked at the photograph for a moment. Promise. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned his attention to the stage. Around him, experts were already discussing theories. Complex explanations filled the air. Electronic systems. Software failures. Manufacturing anomalies. Experimental components. Ethan listened without speaking. Victoria stepped down from the platform and approached the Ferrari. The crowd followed her movement. If anyone believes they can solve it, she said, step forward. For several moments nobody moved. Then a handful of engineers began making their way toward the vehicle. Ethan remained where he was. Watching. Listening. Observing. While everyone else looked at the Ferrari, Ethan seemed more interested in the people studying it. And somewhere behind his calm expression, a quiet curiosity had already begun to grow. The first engineer lasted 11 minutes. The second lasted 14. By noon, 4 different specialists had already stepped away from the Ferrari with the same frustrated expression that had become familiar over the past 5 years. Each arrived carrying confidence. Each left carrying uncertainty. Victoria Hayes watched from a short distance without saying much. She had witnessed this pattern too many times to react anymore. Around the vehicle, small groups formed and dissolved as experts debated theories. Some focused on electronics. Others blamed manufacturing tolerances. A few insisted the problem had to involve software. Every explanation sounded convincing. None of them solved anything. Near the back of the hall, Ethan Carter remained beside his weathered toolbox. He had not moved closer. He had not volunteered an opinion. He simply watched. That alone seemed to attract attention. A tall engineer wearing a company badge noticed him standing alone. "You planning to give it a try?" he asked with a grin. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Maybe." The engineer laughed. "You might want to talk to the people who have already failed first." Several others nearby chuckled. Ethan smiled politely. "That would probably be smart." The engineer seemed disappointed by the lack of argument. "Trust me. If the best teams in the industry could not figure it out, this is not something you solve with a toolbox." Ethan glanced toward the Ferrari. "Maybe." The man laughed again before walking away. Ethan returned his attention to the car. Not the engine. Not the diagnostic equipment. The car itself. His eyes moved slowly across details most people ignored. The way the vehicle sat under the lights. The pattern of wear on certain components. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of details that rarely appeared in reports. His phone vibrated. "Lily. How was your day?" Ethan smiled. "Interesting." 3 dots appeared. "More interesting than my math class?" Ethan laughed softly. "Probably not." Her response came immediately. "That is impossible." He typed back. "You might be right." Another message followed. "Remember. 7 o'clock. Ethan looked at the time. "I remember." He slipped the phone into his pocket. The smile stayed on his face for several moments. Across the room, another attempt had just ended in failure. A mechanic stepped away from the Ferrari shaking his head. Frustration spread through the audience. Some people began leaving their seats. Others checked their phones. The mystery that fascinated them also exhausted them. 5 years of disappointment had a way of doing that. Then something unusual happened. Victoria's chief engineer, Brandon Cole, approached the center of the display area and began reviewing the latest diagnostic data. The crowd immediately paid attention. Brandon had spent more time with the Ferrari than anyone alive. If he could not solve it, most people believed nobody could. Ethan watched him carefully. Not because he expected answers. Because he wanted to see what Brandon looked at first. 10 minutes passed. Brandon focused on screens. Reports. Historical data. Ethan noticed something. Then noticed it again. His expression changed slightly. Not excitement. Not certainty. Curiosity. For the first time all day, he picked up his toolbox. Around him, nobody paid attention. They were too busy watching the experts. But as Ethan slowly started walking toward the Ferrari, a quiet feeling settled in his mind. He was no longer wondering whether the problem could be solved. He was beginning to wonder whether everyone had been looking in the wrong place. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside the exhibition hall had changed. The excitement that filled the room that morning had slowly been replaced by skepticism. Every failed attempt seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. The Ferrari simply could not be fixed. Engineers continued gathering around the vehicle, discussing theories with increasing complexity. Charts appeared on screens. Technical diagrams circulated through tablets and laptops. Yet the car remained exactly where it had been for 5 years. Silent. Unsolved. Ethan Carter stopped several feet from the display platform and set his toolbox on the floor. Nobody paid much attention at first. Most eyes remained focused on Brandon Cole and the engineering team. Brandon stood beside a large monitor reviewing data collected from previous tests. His reputation alone commanded respect. When he spoke, people listened. When Ethan stepped closer to the Ferrari, a few nearby attendees exchanged amused looks. One of them recognized the man from earlier. "Looks like the toolbox finally made it to the car," he joked. Several people laughed quietly. Ethan did not react. He continued studying the vehicle. Not touching it. Not opening anything. Just looking. Another engineer folded his arms. "You planning to solve 5 years of failure by staring at it?" Ethan nodded slightly. "I am planning to understand it first." The answer triggered another round of smiles. Brandon glanced briefly in Ethan's direction before returning to his diagnostics. To him, Ethan was simply another hopeful participant. Nothing more. Victoria Hayes noticed the interaction from across the room. Unlike the others, she did not laugh. She had spent years watching talented people underestimate unusual minds. Experience had taught her something valuable. Confidence often arrived loudly. Competence rarely did. Ethan slowly walked around the Ferrari. One complete circle. Then another. His pace never changed. His expression never changed. Several spectators eventually lost interest and returned their attention to the engineers. But Victoria continued watching. After nearly 10 minutes, Ethan crouched beside the rear section of the vehicle. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not because he had found an answer. Because he had found a question. A very different thing. He stood again and continued walking. Brandon eventually approached him. "See anything useful?" The tone was polite but skeptical. Ethan looked at him. "Maybe." Brandon smiled. "That seems to be a popular answer today." Ethan glanced toward the monitor displaying years of diagnostic records. Everyone appears focused on what the car is doing. Brandon nodded. Naturally. Ethan looked back at the Ferrari. "Has anyone spent much time studying when it behaves normally?" Brandon frowned slightly. The question seemed almost too simple. "Of course." Ethan did not argue. "All right." Brandon waited for more. None came. Ethan simply continued observing. The chief engineer eventually returned to his team. Yet something about the exchange lingered in his thoughts. Across the hall, Victoria noticed that as well. Ethan's phone vibrated once more. "Lily. Did you solve the mystery car yet?" He smiled. "Not yet." Her answer arrived immediately. "I think you will." Ethan looked toward the stage where experts continued debating complicated possibilities. Then he looked back at the Ferrari. For the first time that day, a faint smile appeared on his face. Because while everyone else seemed determined to prove how much they knew, he was beginning to suspect the solution might depend on noticing something they had all ignored. The longer Ethan Carter observed the Ferrari, the more unusual the situation became. Most people assumed he was gathering courage before attempting something impossible. The truth was very different. He still had not decided whether he would touch the car at all. Around him, conversations continued to grow more technical. Engineers debated electrical systems. Consultants reviewed historical test results. Specialists compared notes from previous years. Every explanation sounded intelligent. Every explanation seemed supported by data. Yet the Ferrari remained silent beneath the lights. Ethan slowly walked past the front of the vehicle and stopped near a display board documenting its history. Photographs showed dozens of teams that had worked on the mystery over 5 years. Laboratories, diagnostic facilities, test tracks, international consultants. Millions of dollars had been spent searching for answers. Ethan studied the photographs carefully. Then he looked at the Ferrari again. Something about the relationship between the experts and the machine bothered him. Not because they lacked knowledge. Because they appeared to have approached the problem the same way. Victoria Hayes continued watching from across the room. She had meetings waiting. Investors waiting. Executives waiting. Yet she remained beside the exhibition floor. Ethan's behavior had become more interesting than the engineers arguing around diagnostic screens. Brandon Cole eventually noticed the same thing. He approached Ethan once again. "You have been looking at that car for almost an hour." Ethan nodded. "Something like that." Brandon folded his arms. "Most people would have connected a scanner by now." Ethan smiled faintly. "Most people already did." Brandon could not argue with that. The chief engineer looked toward the Ferrari. "You think we missed something?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I think everyone has been trying very hard to prove they are right." Brandon frowned. "And that is a problem?" Ethan looked at the car. "Sometimes." The answer lingered in Brandon's mind longer than he expected. Nearby, several engineers continued discussing software failures. Ethan listened for a few moments before quietly moving away. He walked around the Ferrari once more. This time his attention focused on details nobody else seemed interested in. The way certain components aged. The condition of surfaces exposed to years of testing. Tiny inconsistencies that seemed meaningless individually. Yet together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. His phone vibrated. Lily again. "How many smart people are there?" Ethan smiled. "A lot." Her reply appeared almost immediately. "Then you should be fine." Ethan laughed softly. "Why?" "Because you always fix things after smart people give up." He stared at the message for several seconds. The simplicity of it made him smile even more. Across the hall, Victoria noticed the expression. Most people who approached the Ferrari carried frustration. Ethan carried curiosity. That difference mattered. An announcement echoed through the building. Another specialist would be allowed a final attempt before the afternoon session ended. Applause followed. Cameras shifted toward the vehicle. Reporters prepared their equipment. The crowd gathered closer. Ethan remained still. Watching. Listening. Thinking. Then his eyes settled on one specific area of the Ferrari for longer than before. Not seconds. Nearly a full minute. Something there had finally captured his attention. Brandon noticed. Victoria noticed. Neither interrupted him. Because for the first time all day, Ethan Carter no longer looked like a man studying a mystery. He looked like a man who had just discovered the first piece of an answer. The crowd barely noticed when Ethan Carter stepped closer to the Ferrari again. Another specialist had just completed an unsuccessful evaluation, and most attention remained focused on the official engineering team. Discussions filled the exhibition hall. Screens displayed technical data. Reporters interviewed experts. Yet Ethan seemed disconnected from all of it. His attention remained fixed on a single area of the vehicle. Not because he understood the answer. Because he no longer believed the question was what everyone thought it was. Victoria Hayes watched from across the floor. She noticed something unusual. Ethan had spent nearly the entire afternoon observing. Very few people possessed that kind of patience. Most wanted immediate results. Most wanted recognition. Ethan appeared interested only in understanding. Brandon Cole approached him once more. This time his expression carried less skepticism. "You keep looking at the same place." Ethan nodded. "I do." Brandon waited. "Why?" Ethan studied the Ferrari for several seconds before answering. "Because it does not fit." Brandon looked toward the section Ethan indicated. Nothing seemed unusual. "What does that mean?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "I am not sure yet." The answer should have sounded frustrating. Instead it sounded honest. Nearby, several engineers overheard the conversation. One of them smiled. "That is convenient." Another laughed. "The mystery solution is always right around the corner." A few people joined in. Ethan did not respond. He had spent most of his life around repair shops. He knew that confidence often arrived before understanding. Brandon looked back toward the vehicle. "You think everyone missed something simple?" Ethan shook his head. "No," the engineers seemed pleased by the answer. Then Ethan continued. "I think everyone missed something important." The smiles faded slightly. Victoria noticed that too. Ethan slowly circled the Ferrari again. This time he stopped near a display containing maintenance records from previous investigations. Thousands of pages had been condensed into summaries. Test dates. Environmental conditions. Diagnostic conclusions. Component replacements. Ethan read them carefully. Minutes passed. Then something caught his attention. Not a technical report. Not a laboratory finding. A date. Just a date. He read it again. Then compared it with another record. His expression remained calm, but a new level of focus appeared in his eyes. Brandon noticed immediately. "Find something?" Ethan looked up. "Maybe." Brandon almost smiled. "You say that a lot." "Because I am still thinking." "For the first time all day," Brandon laughed. Not mockingly. Respectfully. Ethan returned to the records. A pattern seemed to be emerging. Small. Incomplete. But real. More importantly, it connected things that nobody else appeared to be connecting. Across the hall, Victoria quietly dismissed 2 scheduled meetings. Her assistants looked surprised. She ignored their concerns. Something told her the next few hours mattered more than the meetings. Ethan's phone vibrated again. "Lily. How is the mystery?" He smiled. "Getting smaller." Her response appeared immediately. "That sounds good." Ethan looked at the Ferrari standing beneath the lights. For 5 years it had defeated experts from around the world. Entire teams had arrived convinced they would solve it. Entire teams had left disappointed. Yet standing there among the noise, Ethan found himself becoming interested in something else entirely. Not what was wrong with the car. But why every expert had failed in almost exactly the same way. And as that thought settled into place, he began to suspect he was finally looking at the problem from a direction nobody else had considered. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass walls of the exhibition hall as the event entered its final hours. Many attendees had already begun assuming the outcome would be the same as every previous attempt. Another day. Another failure. Another expert leaving with more questions than answers. Yet Victoria Hayes remained near the display platform. So did Brandon Cole. And so did Ethan Carter. The difference was that Ethan no longer spent his time studying the Ferrari alone. He was studying the history surrounding it. Every failed repair. Every diagnostic session. Every report. Every conclusion. The more he read, the more a strange pattern emerged. Not within the vehicle itself. Within the people examining it. Most investigations had started from the same assumption. Most teams had followed the same path. Most experts had trusted the same evidence. Ethan slowly closed a report and looked toward the Ferrari. His expression remained calm, but inside his mind the pieces were beginning to connect. Brandon approached carrying a tablet. "You have been reading for almost an hour." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes the repair starts long before the tools come out." Brandon glanced toward the report spread across the table. "Find anything useful?" Ethan looked at him. "Maybe I found what is not useful." Brandon smiled slightly. "That sounds complicated." "Actually, it sounds simple." That answer lingered between them. Across the room, several engineers were discussing sensor failures. Others debated software architecture. The conversation sounded almost identical to the reports Ethan had spent hours reviewing. Different people. Same conclusions. The realization strengthened his growing suspicion. Victoria eventually joined them. "Mr. Carter." Ethan looked up. "Ms. Hayes. You have not requested access to the vehicle." "Not yet." Victoria seemed genuinely curious. Most people hurry toward the car. Ethan glanced toward the Ferrari. "Everyone else already did that." For a moment, Victoria said nothing. Then she nodded slowly. The answer made sense. More than she wanted to admit. Ethan's phone vibrated. Lily again. He smiled before even opening the message. "How much longer?" she asked. Ethan checked the time. "Not too much longer." "Good. Mom says I keep checking the clock." Ethan laughed quietly. "That makes two of us." He slipped the phone away and returned his attention to the display area. An announcement echoed through the hall. The final public evaluation session would begin shortly. Excitement returned almost immediately. Reporters repositioned cameras. Attendees moved closer to the platform. Engineers gathered near the vehicle. Everyone expected one last attempt before the event ended. Ethan remained still. Watching. Thinking. Then Brandon noticed something unusual. Ethan had stopped looking at the Ferrari entirely. Instead, he was studying a series of photographs mounted beside the display. Images taken during previous investigations. Hundreds of people had walked past them throughout the day without a second glance. Ethan examined every one carefully. His eyes moved from photograph to photograph. Then suddenly stopped. Not on the Ferrari. On something standing beside it. A detail so small most people would never notice. It. Ethan stared at the image for several seconds. Then he moved to another photograph taken years later. The same detail appeared again. His expression changed. Very slightly. Victoria noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ethan looked at the photographs one final time. "I think I finally know where to start." Neither Victoria nor Brandon spoke. For the first time all day, Ethan reached down and opened his toolbox. And as the metallic latches clicked open beneath the bright exhibition lights, the people closest to him sensed that something important had just changed. The sound of Ethan Carter opening his toolbox drew far more attention than it should have. Yet after an entire day of failures, even the smallest change felt significant. Conversations around the exhibition hall began to fade. People who had ignored him earlier now watched carefully. Engineers exchanged skeptical looks. Reporters adjusted cameras toward the display platform. Victoria Hayes remained nearby. Brandon Cole stood beside her with his arms folded. Neither spoke. Ethan lifted only a few simple tools from the box and placed them on a nearby table. Nothing unusual. Nothing expensive. Nothing that suggested a revolutionary breakthrough was about to happen. That alone seemed to confuse people. One engineer finally voiced what others were thinking. "That is it?" Ethan looked up. That is enough. A few quiet laughs spread through the crowd. Ethan ignored them. He approached the Ferrari and stopped beside the area that had captured his attention earlier. For several moments he did nothing. He simply looked. The silence became uncomfortable. People expected action. Ethan offered patience. Brandon checked his watch. Victoria kept her eyes on Ethan. She had spent years watching experts attack the problem immediately. Ethan appeared determined to understand every step before touching anything. After nearly a minute, he reached toward the vehicle and began a careful inspection. His movements were calm and deliberate. No dramatic gestures. No display of confidence. Just steady observation. Several engineers moved closer. They expected complicated diagnostics. Instead they found themselves watching. Someone performed basic checks that should have been completed years ago. One engineer frowned. Surely they already looked at that. Ethan nodded. I am sure they did. Then why repeat it? Ethan glanced toward him. Because I am not checking what they checked. The engineer stared. Then what are you checking? Ethan returned his attention to the Ferrari. What they assumed. The answer spread through the nearby crowd almost immediately. Victoria noticed Brandon's expression change. For the first time all day, the chief engineer appeared genuinely uncertain. Ethan continued working quietly. Every few minutes he stopped and compared what he saw with information from the reports. Several times he stepped back entirely and simply looked at the vehicle. The process seemed slow. Yet each step appeared connected to something only he understood. His phone vibrated. Lily. Ethan checked the message. Did you fix it yet? He smiled. Working on it. A reply appeared instantly. I knew you would. Ethan slipped the phone away and looked at the time. The school performance was getting closer. He could feel the pressure building. Yet rushing now would accomplish nothing. Around him, the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, people laughed when he approached the Ferrari. Now they watched in silence. Even the engineers who doubted him seemed reluctant to interrupt. Something about his confidence felt different. It was not confidence in success. It was confidence in the process. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then Ethan suddenly stopped moving. He stared at a specific component for several seconds. Not because it was broken. Because it appeared normal. Too normal. Brandon noticed immediately. What is it? Ethan did not answer right away. He carefully compared the component to a photograph from years earlier. Then another. Then a third. Victoria stepped closer. The crowd leaned forward. Ethan finally looked up. His expression remained calm, but there was something new behind his eyes. Recognition. Not certainty. Not victory. Recognition. He had finally found the detail that connected 5 years of failures together. And as silence settled across the exhibition hall, everyone sensed they were only moments away from learning what every expert before him had somehow overlooked. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Ethan Carter remained focused on the component in front of him while the crowd waited for an explanation. Cameras pointed toward the display platform. Engineers stood shoulder to shoulder around the Ferrari. Victoria Hayes watched without blinking. Brandon Cole looked as though he was trying to solve the mystery by studying Ethan's face alone. Ethan finally stepped back from the vehicle and looked toward the collection of historical photographs mounted nearby. Then he looked back at the Ferrari. The connection was clear now. 5 years of reports. 5 years of testing. 5 years of failed conclusions. Every piece fit together. The problem was not hidden because it was complicated. The problem was hidden because everyone assumed it could only be complicated. Brandon took a step forward. You found something. Ethan nodded. I think so. The chief engineer glanced at the Ferrari. Can you prove it? Ethan looked at the time. Then at the vehicle. We are about to find out. A ripple moved through the crowd. Even the reporters stopped whispering. Victoria approached the platform. What do you need? Ethan opened his toolbox and selected a simple tool. Nothing expensive. Nothing advanced. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. One of them quietly shook his head. Another folded his arms. The simplicity of what they were seeing seemed impossible. Ethan carefully made a small adjustment. Then another. His movements remained precise and deliberate. No speeches. No dramatic reveal. No attempt to impress anyone. The entire exhibition hall became silent except for the occasional sound of camera shutters. When he finished, Ethan stepped away from the Ferrari and placed the tool back into the box. Brandon stared at him. That is all? Ethan nodded. That is all. A few people laughed nervously. Others looked disappointed. After 5 years, they expected something bigger. More technical. More dramatic. Ethan simply stood beside the vehicle. Victoria looked at him. You are sure? Ethan shrugged lightly. No, the answer surprised everyone. Then he continued. But I am sure enough to try. Victoria held his gaze for a moment before nodding. Do it. The crowd moved closer. Cameras focused on the Ferrari. Brandon stepped beside the driver's door. His expression was impossible to read. Ethan looked toward him. Go ahead. Brandon hesitated. Then he reached inside. The exhibition hall became completely silent. Hundreds of people watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan folded his arms and waited. 1 second passed. Then another. The Ferrari remained still. A few engineers exchanged knowing looks. Then something changed. Very slightly at first. Several heads turned. Victoria leaned forward. Brandon froze. The sound echoed softly through the hall. Then again. Stronger this time. A heartbeat later, the Ferrari responded exactly the way it had been designed to respond all those years ago. The crowd stood motionless. Brandon stared at the vehicle. Victoria stared at Ethan. Reporters forgot to ask questions. Engineers forgot to speak. Nobody seemed capable of processing what had just happened. Ethan remained calm. Almost indifferent. As though the result surprised everyone except him. Brandon slowly looked toward the component Ethan had adjusted. Then toward the historical photographs. Then back toward Ethan. The realization hit him all at once. 5 years. Hundreds of experts. Millions of dollars. Entire teams had searched for answers in the most complicated places imaginable. Ethan had found the truth by questioning the assumption that complexity was required. And as the Ferrari continued operating flawlessly beneath the bright exhibition lights, the silence inside the hall became the loudest reaction anyone had heard all day. For several moments after the Ferrari responded flawlessly, nobody seemed capable of speaking. The exhibition hall stood frozen beneath the bright lights. Reporters stared at their cameras. Engineers looked at one another in disbelief. Brandon Cole remained beside the vehicle, still trying to process what had happened. 5 years of theories. 5 years of investigations. 5 years of increasingly complicated explanations. And somehow the answer had come. From a quiet single father carrying a worn toolbox. Victoria Hayes slowly walked toward Ethan Carter. The crowd parted without being asked. Ethan had already begun placing his tools back into the box. The reaction surrounding him seemed almost irrelevant. His attention kept drifting toward the clock mounted on the far wall. Victoria noticed. "Mr. Carter." Ethan looked up. "Yes, ma'am." For a moment she simply studied him. "Do you understand what you just accomplished?" Ethan glanced toward the Ferrari. "I fixed a car." A few people nearby laughed softly. Not because the answer was funny. Because it was honest. Victoria smiled. "That car defeated some of the most respected minds in the industry." Ethan shrugged. "They were trying to solve a difficult problem. And you were not?" Ethan closed the toolbox. "I was trying to understand it." The answer spread quietly through the crowd. Brandon finally stepped forward. "You were right." Ethan looked at him. Brandon shook his head slowly. "We kept searching for something complicated." Ethan nodded. "Most people did." Brandon glanced toward the Ferrari. "Why?" Ethan looked around the exhibition hall. "Because complicated answers feel important." Silence followed. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Victoria folded her arms and smiled. "You know there is a reward." Ethan nodded. "I heard. You earned it." Ethan checked the time again. The movement caught Victoria's attention. "You have somewhere to be." Ethan smiled. "My daughter has a school performance." Victoria laughed softly. "Of course she does." One of the reporters stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, would you be willing to explain exactly how you solved it?" Several cameras immediately turned toward him. Ethan considered the question for a moment. Then he shook his head politely. "The engineers can explain it." Brandon looked surprised. "You should take the credit." Ethan smiled. "I do not need the credit." The answer seemed to affect the room more than the repair itself. Victoria extended her hand. Ethan shook it. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for solving the problem." Ethan nodded politely. "You are welcome." Around them, the crowd finally began applauding. Not because of the Ferrari. Not because of the challenge. Because everyone recognized something rare. A man who never needed attention to prove his value. Ethan lifted his toolbox and started walking toward the exit. Reporters called after him. Engineers tried asking questions. Investors wanted introductions. He acknowledged them with polite smiles but never stopped moving. Outside, the evening sun was beginning to settle across the Texas skyline. His phone vibrated. "Lily. Are you coming?" Ethan smiled immediately. "Already on my way." "Promise?" He looked toward the parking lot and his aging pickup truck waiting near the curb. "Promise." 20 minutes later he slipped quietly into the auditorium just before the lights dimmed. On stage, Lily searched the audience. The moment she spotted him, her face lit up. Ethan smiled and gave a small wave. In that instant, the Ferrari no longer mattered. The challenge no longer mattered. The applause, the cameras, the reward, the recognition, all of it faded away. Because while everyone else had spent the day discovering what Ethan Carter could do, the person who mattered most had always known exactly who he was.